All it takes is a spark. After a day when Russian missiles rained down across the whole of Ukraine, 2 projectiles landing over the border in a Polish farming village Tuesday, killing 2. We'll gauge the evidence and the latest reactions from NATO headquarters, where, according to its Article 5, an attack against one is an attack against all. How close did they come this time to Article 5? Never during the Cold War did the West engage in active battle with the Soviet Union. Does Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and his battlefield setback since arguably make this a more volatile moment than at any time since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis? Europe's not taking any chances. It's now ramped up defense spending, with EU nations even pondering the idea of pooling their purchases of military hardware. Does Europe have the means and the resolve, if the standoff spirals, to secure lasting peace? How all in do Ukraine's allies have to go? Can they, for instance, talk de-escalation, Black Sea grain exports, when the Kremlin's bombing Ukrainian cities smack in the middle of a G20 summit? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, how does NATO deal with Russia? Joining us from Warsaw, he is Poland's former defense minister, Janusz Oniewski. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
In a previous life, Ukraine was her beat in NATO's political office. Samantha de Bendern is Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
Welcome back as well from Vilnius political analyst Alexandra Filipenko. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And France 24 correspondent Pierre Benazet joins us from Brussels, where that NATO meeting took place. Nice to see you.
Hello.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. So no escalation this time, but nearly 9 months after Russia's invasion, it is the first spillover from the war in Ukraine, enough to prompt, again, that emergency meeting of NATO ambassadors. Kathy Kadir Clifford has more.
Easing international concern. NATO's Secretary General said the missile that hit the Polish village of Provodov was likely fired by Ukraine's air defenses.
Our preliminary analysis suggests that the incident was likely caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile. But let me be clear, this is not Ukraine's fault. Russia bears ultimate responsibility as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine.
A message echoed by the Polish president.
Nothing, absolutely nothing indicates that this was an intentional attack on Poland. What has happened, the fact that a rocket fell onto our territory, was not an intentional action.
World leaders from across the globe have shared their condolences, including French President Emmanuel Macron.
I offered our condolences for the victims of the missile strikes on Polish territory yesterday. I told them of my solidarity, and we expressed our commitment to work with Poland in order to establish the truth about these strikes.
Russia has denied involvement.
We want to emphasize that high-precision strikes were carried out only on targets on the territory of Ukraine and at a distance of no closer than 35 kilometers from the Ukrainian-Polish border.
NATO ambassadors gathered for emergency talks after the blast on Tuesday killed 2 people at a Polish grain facility around 6 kilometers north of Ukraine. The war's first deadly spillover onto NATO territory.
And let me begin with you, Pierre Benazet, because we have this meeting that took place of NATO ambassadors. We know about Article 5, but there's also something called Article 4. Tell us about that.
It is just one step underneath. This is the first go-to article, if you wish, when threats arise. There are 3 conditions. Depending on those conditions, you can ask for a triggering of Article 4. And these 3 conditions are when a country's security, territorial integrity, and political independence are threatened. If this happens, You can ask for a meeting of the NATO, the North Atlantic Council, to be convened, and at this meeting, such as one that happened this morning, you can ask for the triggering of Article 4. So it has to be asked for by a NATO member state. It has happened 7 times in the past. 5 countries have asked for it. 4 countries have asked for it at the beginning of the war in the Ukraine in order to provide for reinforcements at the eastern border of NATO. And it also happened 3 times with Turkey at the beginning of the 90s with the war in the Gulf, for Iraq and for Syria. And for example, 8 years ago, when Turkey asked for the triggering of Article 4, Patriot missile batteries were deployed to southern Turkey on the Syrian border from Germany, from Italy, and maybe Denmark, in order to protect Turkey from threats coming from the Syrian regime. So what happened today was as close to a triggering of Article 4 as could be, because obviously the NATO members were in full solidarity with Poland and proposed, for example, these German air patrols on the eastern borders with the Ukraine and with Russia in order to assist Poland to defend its skies.
And it's not every day that we, since the start of this war, that we have seen Moscow praising the United States. The Kremlin floating the narrative that it was the U.S. That has shown restraint, and that somehow Poland is the one that's pouring oil on the fire. Let's take a listen.
I would like to invite you once again to pay attention to a restrained reaction of the United States, which contrasted to an absolutely hysterical reaction on the Polish side and a number of other countries. Why did it happen? You should address this question to Warsaw. And probably ask Polish officials to be more restrained, more balanced and professional when they're talking about such sensitive and potentially dangerous subjects.
Janusz Onyszkiewicz, we've seen the Polish ambassador this Wednesday summoned in Moscow, and yet, as Pierre was reporting earlier, the Poles were quite restrained during the meeting. What's this all about?
Well, I think that there is a feeling that Poland should somehow react to what has happened. At the beginning, we didn't know exactly where the missile came from, so perhaps our authorities overreacted a bit, but there was kind of a panic. And what I'm afraid is that, we in Poland had to wait a bit too long for official sort of position of Polish government on the situation. But I think that whatever happens, this explosion on Polish soil is the result of Russian aggression on Ukraine. That's absolutely clear. So I think that some kind of a reaction should be.
And at this point in time, there are calls for an investigation. I want to get to that. Samantha de Bendern, first off, you before I ask you about the Ukrainian reaction, you heard there Janusz mentioning how first it was panic stations, and it was panic stations in our newsroom too. When we first saw that missiles had fallen over the border, we thought, "Uh-oh, where is this all going to go?" What was your reaction?
Well, my reaction wasn't really that panicky. First of all, because even if it had been a Russian-fired missile that had deliberately attacked Polish territory, which seemed very unlikely in spite of the irrationality of Russian behavior, it really didn't seem likely. But even if it was, there is no magic button that makes NATO suddenly trigger Article 5 and get into sort of war mode. There's a whole process of consultations. The country that's attacked has to ask for Article 5. Consultations to take place. Poland didn't do that. I actually think that everything considered, Poland acted with restraint. First of all, they had internal discussions to try and find out what happened. Of course, they're going to be panicking about a missile falling in their territory. I mean, it would be really strange if they didn't. But they consulted amongst themselves. They then said to NATO they were considering invoking Article 4, which has just been explained, a step below Article 5, which is for consultations. So that gave the signal very early on that they did not believe that this was a deliberate attack. And at every single stage, I feel the Poles have said, we need to find out. Let's wait to see what happened. So, of course, the Polish government is caught between public opinion, which is saying, there's a missile attack on our territory, you have to do something, and international considerations of not wanting to escalate. So my own opinion is that this was actually a very well-calibrated response.
And at the same time, diving right in, is Ukraine's president. In the past hour, he's been making televised remarks. Volodymyr Zelensky saying, I have no doubt that this is not our missile. I believe this was a Russian missile based on our military reports. And he says that it's imperative that Ukraine become a part of the investigation. Why is Ukraine going against the grain here?
Well, I think that, first of all, it is a shame that Zelensky would say that he has no doubt. I mean, even Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, is saying there are suppositions that. No one is actually saying for sure that they know what is happening, apart from Zelensky, who's saying he has no doubt. And that is not the communication style we've become used to from the Ukrainians. We've become used to them being very sophisticated, adopting Western kind of messaging. And this is, sadly, going back to some old reflexes that would have a much, one would expect from Moscow, not from Ukraine. That they want to be part of the investigation, I think, makes absolute sense, particularly if there are doubts that this could be a Ukrainian missile. So, of course, they should be part of the investigation. But this kind of attitude that we've seen in the last 24 hours is not what one would have expected from a country that is fighting for the kind of values that we in the West are espousing. And one of these values is when you're a head of state, when you're in government, you do not say things like you're sure about something unless you really are. You wait for the evidence to come out. And every other single head of state is giving out measured responses, apart from the Russians, of course, who also know everything. But we expect that from them, not from the Ukrainians at this point.
And we've been looking all day at those roped-off images of the investigation scene in Poland. Alexandra Filipenko, what do you make of Volodymyr Zelensky's response?
Well, of course, since Ukraine is in the war, so of course their response is probably not that measured. And as we know, Ukraine as well as Russia uses those S-300 missiles. So that is why it could have been both from both sides. But of course, at first, all Russian political analysts thought and saw this as an assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria before the First World War. And everyone, that was the first reaction, because of course, everyone thought that this was a Russian missile at first. And the response from President Zelensky is probably not that measured for now, but of course they definitely want to be a part of the investigation, and they should be a part of the investigation. But we'll see what happens next. But for now, it's probably only because Ukraine and the presidential administration is now under heavy pressure for more than 8 months now during this entire horrible conflict since February 24th. February 24th.
Samantha de Bending?
Well, yes, of course they're under pressure. I still don't think it excuses this kind of reaction. I think that one could have expected them to say, we need to investigate, we will reserve judgment until we have all the elements. That would have been a very short, very non-committal reaction that would have been met with complete understanding by the West, would not have given food to the Russian propaganda machine, which of course is now going into full gear, saying, look at this bloodthirsty Zelensky, he's accusing us. Now everybody knows that he's lying. I mean, they're really going into full gear. So he's handing them a gift that he doesn't need to hand them. And that is, again, I think that in view of the kind of pressure that Zelensky is under, he's also under pressure, I believe, from the West. We've had a lot of people visiting Kiev recently. We had Jake Sullivan, the head of the National Security Council, U.S. National Security Advisor in Ukraine 10 days ago. We had William Burns, head of the CIA, who was there yesterday, who was actually in a bomb shelter in the U.S. Embassy. We don't know what's happening behind these closed doors, but the supposition is that Zelensky is being told, you're going to have to start thinking of negotiating at some point. So I suspect that Zelensky is also quite angry at the moment and is worried that he's losing Western support. This is not the way to go about it. But
if I can add something.
Yes.
Janusz Onyszkiewicz.
Yes.
Hello. Oh, I'm sorry. It was Pierre Benazet speaking. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Pierre.
There are three other factors that we could just add to what Samantha the Band just said. First, obviously, the Ukraine wants to appear as a serious military force, and people who do know where they are striking and what they are doing with the armaments they have and the weapons they received from the West. Obviously, this one was in their stockpiles, but they do not want to appear as amateurs. That's one thing to say for Zelensky. The second is that he's claiming he has a track somewhere on a radar where you see these missiles that went to the village of Przevodov, somewhere in a Ukrainian radar. And the third factor is also that's for the Ukraine. You have to also bear in mind that there is still a possibility that the NATO says so that the missile comes from the Russian side. It has not been completely evacuated, so to speak.
Right. So there are three possibilities, but it seems as though that's not as likely as the Ukrainians would claim. Samantha de Bender mentioning that visit by the head of the CIA to Kyiv this Wednesday, Janusz Onyszkiewicz, he's been in Warsaw speaking with President Duda. Your thoughts on the context, if you will, surrounding relations between Poland, Ukraine, and the United States at this pivotal moment?
Well, coming back to Zelensky's announcements, I would say that Zelensky obviously would think that attack of Russia on Polish territory would be, well, to put it rather bluntly, a sort of a godsend, because that would bring in NATO much closer to support of Ukraine and to side with Ukraine. So I think that this temptation was quite considerable, and that's why he probably also declared that the missile was fired not from Ukraine. There is also another possibility that the missile was fired from Belarus, which is something which is worth exploring. I do hope that the trajectory would be very carefully reconstructed, and then we will know for certain. But I think that the situation in Ukraine is getting desperate because of the attack on infrastructure. This attack on infrastructure is not affecting only Ukraine, it's affecting other countries like Hungary or Moldova, who are cut off from the energy supply and oil supply because of the attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine. So it's getting wider and wider. And I think that what really could and should be done is to deploy, following the Turkish example, deploying missile defense system along Polish border, and with the aim to eliminate all missiles coming towards Poland. Also, obviously, over Ukrainian territory, because otherwise it couldn't be done. So I think that that's something which we should consider.
Samantha Mann?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I've been saying this since the beginning of the war. Is there anything preventing NATO from, in the name of defending its own territory, deploying some kind of air defense system a few kilometers into Ukrainian territory? And this could be the trigger for that, whoever is behind this missile attack. One thing that a lot of analysts are pointing out is the fact that the missile fell inside the Polish border, but not far from a very big Ukrainian energy hub. called Dobrotwierska, which is an energy, an electrical power station, and that could have been the aim of the Russian missile that the Ukrainians then tried to divert and missed, and that would have meant that the S-300 fell into Polish territory. And just from the Ukrainian point of view, and maybe if there's some NATO PR people talking to Zelensky right now, during the Kosovo War, NATO had a few pretty big mistakes. There was the mistake on the Chinese embassy, and also, more importantly, a convoy of Albanians was killed by a NATO strike. And NATO came up with a kind of a mea culpa pretty quickly, said, yes, we made a mistake. And people do forgive mistakes that are admitted and owned up to. Zelensky may indeed have information, and in a few days we may all be having a completely different conversation about this. But what is so important in messaging, particularly at that level, is to show restraint and to wait until there's absolutely no doubt and that you can actually show the evidence before asserting things.
Ukraine, which is bracing for winter, which, as was just said by Janusz Oniszkiewicz, would be happy if NATO was further drawn in, what with Russia targeting military installations. But if you look at what unfolded on Tuesday, you might argue it wasn't such a great day for Moscow. The Ukrainian General Staff's Facebook page claiming that 77 cruise missiles were intercepted, 77 Russian cruise missiles. Each one of those costs an awful lot of money. They're also saying that they were able to intercept Iranian drones and other UAVs. And Alexander Filipenko, we've had the U.S. Defense Minister this Wednesday saying that his NASAMS air defense system have had a 100% success rate in intercepting Russian missiles. You do have to wonder how long Moscow can keep on with these missile attacks all across the country.
And yes, this is one of the big questions. And if we look at the budget for 2023, the Russian budget, of course, as you can expect, Russia has the skyrocketing defense spending, of course. The defense spending goes more than $80 billion and more or less the same in euro right now. And of course, they will be spending much more. And also there is in the budget, it's difficult to allocate more than $112 billion. It's hidden somewhere, and probably it will also go to defense expenditures. But what's also interesting in Russian budget, if you look at it, they have the expenses on national security and law enforcement at the same level as the expenditure on army. So basically, the protection of the government from its people is the same as spending on the army. And this shows probably what the Kremlin is expecting in 2023. Maybe they think that they won't be that successful in the war front, but they are afraid that something might happen inside the country. But for now, it's absolutely skyrocketing defense spending, and it's difficult to say how can they keep it up if it continues after a few years, if it continues in 2023 or even in 2024.
Yeah, tell us, Alexander, when you look at Russian media and interviews in the last few days, at the beginning of the war, they had to give up on the objective of trying to capture the capital. Now they've had to give up the capital of one of those 4 regions they claim to have annexed. What's the objective when it comes to Ukraine for the Kremlin?
At the beginning of the war, President Putin said, well, as they called it, the special military operation. And officially, he declared that they want to defend the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, those breakaway republics of Ukraine. And officially, the point of the war and the main target was to defend those republics that decided later on to be part of the Russian Federation. And only through the propaganda channels and only through what's been happening on the ground, we knew that they were planning to capture Kiev and they were planning to capture almost the entire territory of Ukraine. But officially, this special military operation, and still it's called a special military operation, for now, it's still the aims are to defend the Donetsk and Luhansk republics that are now parts of Russia. And of course, now that they had to leave Kherson region, that is considered to be a Russian territory. And President Putin said that everyone there is Russian right now. For now, it's for the propaganda, it's very difficult to navigate those new the new situation right now. And looking at the news channels and looking at the propaganda, well, the only press that is in Russia right now, it's propaganda actually. So for now, they are only saying that we have to support the military, whatever they decide. We have to support them. And General Surovikin, who is now the head of the special military operation, he, of course, as probably everyone would do at his place, at least in Russia, he, of course, blames people who came before him. And he just recently, he became the head of the special military operation. And so now they are trying to navigate this new situation somehow.
What do you think, Samantha de Bender, the objective is right now for Moscow when it comes to Ukraine? What do they want to do?
Well, I think the first objective is to hold on to the territory that they've already got. They've still managed to increase the amount of territory that they had since February 24th of this year. But they have also lost quite a bit of territory. They have lost Kherson. They are still claiming that Kherson is part of the Russian Federation. And in a kind of a desire to consolidate their hold of some of the other cities, they're now naming Mariupol and Melitopol military hero cities of Russia. So they're really saying these cities are part of Russia. On the left bank of the Dnieper, so just the other side of the city of Kherson, Russian soldiers are, I've seen some reports that I haven't had confirmed by main news channels. These are reports on Russian Telegram channels of soldiers refusing to continue holding the bank because they're not being given the adequate equipment. They haven't got adequate training. The command seems to be in complete disarray. So Russia, I would say that there are problems in the Kremlin, and that there are a number of things that make me feel that. First of all, the whole mention of the fact that military spending is also looking at the National Guard. We have all heard of the Wagner Group, the private military group Wagner, headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin. There are rumors, again, these are in as yet unconfirmed reports, but on very reliable, I would say, Russian dissident channels, saying that people who are now joining Wagner have to answer a questionnaire. And one of these questions is, would you be prepared to shoot people in Moscow if there were to be some kind of internal uprising? The most important signal came with the execution of the former Wagner prisoner of war earlier on this week, when a member of the Wagner elite, the Wagner private military group, was taken prisoner in Ukraine. He was then sent back to Russia and executed in a kind of summary execution that Yevgeny Prigozhin welcomed. And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, this is none of our business. Now, in a state, even in a dictatorship, the state has a monopoly of violence. It looks as though in Russia today, the Russian state no longer has the monopoly of violence. That is a really, really serious indicator that the central power in Moscow is not controlling everything. And insofar as what this means for 2023, well, I think we can expect some pretty big earthquakes in Russia if things go on like this.
Janusz Oniskiewicz, if you've been around long enough, you know that it's very difficult to engage in Kremlinology, to know what's happening inside.
Well, it is absolutely true. But I want to say that first, that it was very well said that the Russian security forces, not military, but security forces, police, all sorts of forces are much more numerous than the Russian army. But I want to return to the problem of missiles. It is true that Russia is running out, probably, of missiles, but the trouble is that Russia may probably get these missiles from elsewhere. Because Russia simply cannot produce them fast enough to replace what is being used. So I think it would be extremely important to look at it, to block the deliveries from Iran. I think this is already more or less done, and so from other places. That's absolutely critical. But coming back to Russian goals in Ukraine, at the beginning, Putin, made this quite clear that he doesn't only want to defend. His idea was to launch the whole operation because to defend these areas. But what he wanted was to do the denazification of Ukraine and also demilitarization. Well, these two concepts obviously are now sort of on ice. This is no longer repeated. But the problem which Putin has is a problem of pirates who are boarding a ship, sinking their own ship to make their resolve in getting this ship more vivid and more strong. And this is more or less the situation, because Putin actually cut himself off from conceding the territories he captured to Ukraine. Because according to the Russian constitution, this is not possible. Russian area is sacred. So, once Putin declared that all these territories from Lugansk to Crimea are part of Russia, then he is in a certain trap. He probably doesn't know what to do.
Right. And so that's why when we have a Russia on the back foot, and at the same time, missiles that cross over the border into your country, that has the whole word worry. The last time Russia crossed swords with a NATO member, it was when Turkey in 2015 shot down a Sukhoi fighter jet that crossed over from Syria. Turkey, whose president was at the heart of discussions at the G20 summit in Bali, but stayed in his lane, as if you will, as mediator in the bid to extend the UN-backed deal to allow grain exports via the Black Sea.
I think that insisting on this incident by saying this is Russian-made will cause provocation. We are trying to gather Russia and Ukraine around the same table as soon as possible. Using provocation while we are engaged in this effort would not be right.
Pierre Benazir, what to make of the role of NATO member Turkey?
Well, it is a very tough time for the 29 other NATO allies. Dealing with Turkey has become increasingly difficult as of, if you will, the start of the negotiations with Finland and Sweden. It was also the case before. I mean, we remember what happened in the Eastern Mediterranean when Turkish ships were foraging for oil in Greek or Cyprus waters. There were consultations within NATO, and there had to be negotiations there that was very tense between Turkey and the others. Turkey was always looking for support ever since the failed coup against Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And now, ever since Sweden and Finland have made public their bid to join NATO, breaking with decades, centuries even, of neutrality, we have seen that Recep Tayyip Erdogan is trying to use that bid of these two Nordic countries to join NATO in order to gain political, to will political gain, if you will, within the alliance, and also in terms of image within his own country. He has succeeded in part because we've seen Sweden changing its constitution in order to allow for more stringent laws against terrorists. And the NATO is waiting for these two countries. We still need the signature from Ankara. We also still need the signature from Viktor Orban. I mean, from Budapest. The Hungarians are still in a very
says it's on the way.
It's underway. It's a special position, but we have mixed signals as well from Viktor Orban. In the same time, we've seen his comments today when he was saying that Volodymyr Zelensky was not giving the right signals. So it's very complicated for the NATO members to deal with Turkey. They are trying to do their best. They were very supportive of Turkey's initiative for the grain export scheme, and they're also always at the same time trying to exert some influence on Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who on his side is also trying to make internal political gains by having a very firm position on things. But he's acting as an intermediary here, which he has done already in the past.
In the past, so let me pick up on that, because we have the United Nations. One source there quoted as saying that there's reasons to be cautiously optimistic, Samantha de Bendern, on the renewal of that Black Sea grain initiative. So overall, when you look at NATO, again, it's dealing with Russia and what is a huge crisis. Is Turkey an asset or a liability?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I would say, all in all, that it's probably an asset, in spite of the fact that it is somehow compromising NATO unity. But when you have 30 member states, it's a pretty big deal to get 30 countries that have very different histories, both within and without the alliance, different cultures, different languages, different religious heritage, to agree on things. So what Erdogan has done, he is managing to straddle a very, very difficult divide that no other NATO member really could, without being accused of being too soft towards Putin. Erdogan is basically, he's a strong man. He holds his country as, basically in a quasi-dictatorship-like grip, which allows him to have a common language with Putin that no other member state in NATO really can. And in spite of all the criticism that has been leveled against Macron and against other people who want to have a dialogue with Russia, it's better to have some kind of open door, some kind of channel of communication than none, because then that really would make the world a much more dangerous place than it really is. And just on this NATO unity, we talked about Dmitry Peskov, the NATO spokesperson, the
Kremlin spokesperson.
The Kremlin spokesperson at the beginning of the show, praising the United States and criticizing other NATO members.
Poland in this particular case.
And Poland. That is typical Kremlin speak. Anything that they can do to try and divide NATO members, to them is sort of manna from heaven. Or we can find a way to make the alliance less united. What they want is a disunited alliance. And I think that if NATO manages to contain Turkey's behavior and still use Turkey as a go-between, that could be the best of both worlds for everyone.
All right, for now, there seem to be major chinks in the armor. And we also had a hard-fought final statement at the G20 summit in Bali. It included a declaration that, quote, most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine. That included the backing of non-aligned nations that at the start of the war had shied away from taking sides. A lot's happened in these nearly 9 months since February the 24th. And there's also been, and it was mentioned by Emmanuel Macron, intense lobbying by the likes of France.
We have a responsibility to prepare for peace, which is exactly the position that I believe the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany hold today. But it is also at the heart of the discussions that I have had with President Erdogan, with President Xi Jinping, and with Prime Minister Modi. All three will have an important role, and I want to underline the long discussion we had with President Erdogan, who also plays a very useful role.
Alexander Filipenko, let me play devil's advocate here. The fact that you have this growing consensus that by the major powers of the world, the rest of them, and that some of the others, those closest to Russia, are at least even taking a step back. Does that perhaps play in Vladimir Putin's favor? After all, he loves it when it's us versus them.
Yes, absolutely. And exactly to what's already been said, for Kremlin, it's the best way for everyone to get divided. And even in NATO, in the EU, or in the United States, it's the best way for Kremlin to move forward and for them to get what they want. But for now, probably while the support of the United States is strong, and especially since Democrats managed to hold power in the Senate, and they are quite strong in the lower chamber. And while President Biden is the president, I think the support for Ukraine will still be quite strong. And I think that President Zelensky knows it for now, even though, of course, Jake Sullivan probably gave the message that there must be some form of negotiation. But President Zelensky made it very clear that the first step is for Russia to leave the whole of Ukraine's territory, to go back to the territory of 1991 with the Crimea, of course, and everything. So for now, yes, I think that Ukraine might be feeling that Europe might be backing down. But for now, since the United States support is quite strong and the American people's support is strong for now, according to Gallup poll and Pew Research Center. So I think that Ukraine still feels somewhat confident in the fact that the United States and Europe will continue supporting it.
Janusz Oniszkiewicz, when you think back to when you were Poland's defense minister and you look at this almighty standoff that is unfolding today, is NATO ready if it were to spin out of control, if it were to spill over across the border?
Well, I think that NATO would respond properly. Well, I have no doubt about it. And we always wanted to have some kind of extra assurances from NATO, despite of the fact that in 90s, Russia looked fairly benevolent, but we knew from the very beginning that Russia is unstable. There was all sorts of turmoil in Russia and could return to its imperial past. So I think that that's why we were so determined to join NATO. But coming back to other issues, I would like to say that Turkey clearly depends economically on Russia. After all, Russians tourists are sort of, coming in masses to Turkey. Well, there is also trade growing, and Erdogan simply cannot ignore this fact, having in mind that next year he will have a presidential election. That might be a problem. And as far as Russia's sort of attitude is concerned, I think that the problem with Russia is that Russia is loved to be feared. Russia considers that Russia is great only if Russia has big opponents. There is no good for great country to have as opponents some minor countries on Pacific or somewhere else. Russia must have a real opponent, and that's United States and NATO. So that really makes Russian proud. And the fact that, after all, Putin sort of threw a gauntlet to Ukraine and to NATO to some extent is an element of sort of national pride, which I think is very dangerous.
Samantha de Bender, a final word on this. How dangerous is it?
I think that NATO is ready to respond to any threat as it is today. A lot will depend on who is president of the United States in the next 2 years. And I think from that point of view, Europe really needs to get its defense act together, because the United States might not always be prepared to come and take us out of whatever mess we get ourselves into.
And it's certainly been a point of discussion by EU defense ministers this very week. I know they're talking about joint procurement of weapons, trying to think about how they pool those resources. So much more to talk about as this continues, goes forward. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to thank you, Samantha de Bender, and I want to thank Alexandra Filipenko for being with us from Vilnius, Yanis Onyszkiewicz in Warsaw, and Pierre Benazet in Brussels. Thank you for being with us here in the Francophone.
Thank you.